The man seen here was one of the greatest explorers of all time. His name was Ferdinand Magellan. He was the person who planned and led one of the most dangerous and deadly expeditions in history, the first voyage around the world. He was born in the year 1480 in the tiny kingdom of Portugal, in a small town that lies far off in the distant hills. Magellan was born during a time when the world was just starting to be explored by men in sailing ships. As a matter of fact, when Magellan was only 8 years old, explorers from Portugal had just become the first Europeans to reach the southern tip of Africa, a feat that made them the greatest explorers of their time. Ferdinand was born into a wealthy family during an age when the richest people in Europe still lived in castles like this one. And when he was 10, young Magellan was sent off to live in the castle of the king and queen after his parents died. And while learning to be a knight at the royal castle, Magellan must have heard tales of the amazing adventures of the great explorers, because when Magellan was just 12 years old, Christopher Columbus became the first person to cross the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and to reach what became known as the New World, the continents of North and South America. As a child, Magellan must have dreamt of the fabulous adventures that he could have if he became an explorer. But the truth is that the great explorers of this time weren't just trying to find adventure. Back then, there were few good maps, and people knew very little about the world. And almost all of the great explorers were searching for a new trade route to the eastern parts of Asia, places such as India, China, and Japan, because they knew that by finding such a route, they could gain control of the rich trade in Asian luxury goods, things like spices, jewels, silks, and porcelains that were produced there and for which there was such a great demand in Europe. And this was definitely true of the Portuguese explorer named Vasco da Gama, who became the first European to reach India by sailing around the tip of Africa in 1498, when Magellan was only 18 years old. Because of Vasco da Gama's famous voyage, Portugal soon began to control trade between Asia and Europe. And that was why, as a young man, Magellan was able to make several trips around Asia on Portuguese trading ships. As a matter of fact, he was one of the first Europeans to sail as far as the Spice Islands, which lay far to the southeast of the mainland of Asia. Probably it was because Magellan had spent so much time at sea, traveling to faraway places, that he learned so much about sailing and geography. And as the years passed by, Magellan also studied astronomy and navigation. And the more he studied, the more he began to think that there must be a faster way to the Spice Islands than sailing all the way around Africa. Because to get there from Europe, and then to come back with a load of spices, took about 1.5 years. He started to think that Asia couldn't be far from the Americas, and that the fastest route must lie to the west, across the Atlantic Ocean. The problem was that Christopher Columbus had looked again and again for a passage to Asia and had never found one. But Magellan planned to search far to the south of where Columbus had been looking, because he thought that once he found the tip of South America, all he would have to do is to sail around it, go the short way to the Spice Islands, and then finish his journey back to Europe by continuing to sail west all the way around the world, which was something no one had ever done before. And even though Magellan had no idea of how much ocean he would have to cross or what dangers he might encounter, in 1514 he decided to take his plan to the King of Portugal and find out if he would give him the ships and men he needed for his dangerous voyage. But just like the Portuguese king seen here had refused to help Columbus, Magellan was refused Portugal's help as well. This time because the king just didn't like Magellan or his plan. And so, in the year 1517, Magellan traveled to the nearby country of Spain, to the palace of the king. And soon Magellan convinced the Spanish king, Charles I, that his country could get much richer if it could find a better trade route to Asia. And that was why the king decided to give him everything he needed to sail around the world. It took 3 years from 1517 to 1519 for Magellan to get the king's approval, as well as the ships and supplies he needed for his voyage. But it is interesting to look at a few of the big changes that were taking place in the world at that time. For example, in 1517, here in Germany, a priest named Martin Luther was breaking away from the Catholic Church and would end up starting the first Protestant religion. And in 1518, here in the small villages of the New World, hundreds of native people were starting to die from diseases accidentally carried across the Atlantic Ocean by Europeans. And in February of 1519, this man, Hernando Cortés, and a group of Spanish soldiers were just leaving on an expedition that would destroy the Aztec kingdom of Mexico and bring Spanish rule, language, and religion to their land. Meanwhile, only 7 months later, in this shallow harbor in southern Spain, Magellan could be found checking over each of his 5 ships one last time. It was on the 20th of September in the year 1519 that Magellan's ships, with a crew of 241 men aboard, headed out into the Atlantic Ocean to try to sail around the world. But they hadn't been at sea very long before some of the crewmen started complaining about how Magellan was running things. And soon the problems got so bad that Magellan had to arrest one of his captains for not following orders. But in spite of these problems, they went on. For a while, it was stormy crossing the Atlantic. Then there was no wind, and they couldn't sail. But eventually, they reached the coast of South America. They headed down the coast until they got to the harbor of Rio de Janeiro, which is in present-day Brazil, and they stayed there for 2 weeks. Then they sailed far to the south and began to search for a way around the tip of South America. But winter was coming, and bad weather and stormy seas forced Magellan to stop exploring and spend the winter months anchored in a harbor, just waiting for the weather to get better. During this time, one of his ships was destroyed by a powerful storm. The sailors grew restless. Some refused to follow orders, and Magellan even had one of his captains put to death. But in October of 1520, as spring arrived, it got warmer and the explorers headed off to search for a way around South America. They say that Magellan cried tears of joy when he finally did find the way. But the narrow strait he found, now called the Strait of Magellan, was very rocky, and the sailors had to keep testing to make sure the water was deep enough. And as they went further into the strait, one of his ships deserted the fleet and headed back to Spain. It was late November, and the expedition was in its 14th month when the 3 remaining ships sailed out of the strait and into a huge ocean that Magellan named the Pacific, which means peaceful, because its waters seemed so smooth compared to the rough waters of the strait. Then they sailed on for over 3 months without seeing any land except for 2 uninhabited islands. During this time, the sailors grew more and more afraid of what might happen to them. Not only were they afraid of being lost at sea, But they also worried about starving. Then their water got so bad that it tasted way too awful to drink. The sailors also got a disease called scurvy. And to keep from dying, they had to eat the rats that lived on the ships, as well as leather hides and even sawdust. And so, during these long months at sea, with nothing but water all around them, 19 crew members died. But finally, in early March of 1521, they reached the tropical island we now know as Guam. Here they found enough fresh water and food to carry them as far as the islands now called the Philippines. But in the Philippines, it wasn't long before a horrible thing happened, because Magellan and many of his sailors were killed in a terrible battle between two native tribes. After that, only 110 men were still alive, and because there were so few crew members, only 2 ships out of the 3 that remained could be taken when they left to find the Spice Islands. And even though the explorers weren't very far from the Spice Islands, they got lost after sailing in the wrong direction. But after turning around, they finally got there. In the Spice Islands, the ships were loaded with spices, and then the explorers decided that one ship, the Trinidad, should try to get to the Spanish colony of Panama by sailing east back across the Pacific, while the other ship, the Victoria, should sail west across the Indian Ocean, around Africa, and on to Europe. And after the 2 ships headed off in different directions, once again the explorers suffered from hunger and sickness, and then the Trinidad was forced to return to the Spice Islands after half the crew died. But early in September of the year 1522, the Victoria finally made it to Europe when it sailed into the Spanish harbor it had left from almost 3 years before. And by then, only 18 men were still left alive out of the 241 who had begun the expedition. And even though the great explorer Magellan never lived to see this day, the few that survived had managed to do what no one had ever done before. They had sailed about 50,000 miles, or 83,000 kilometers, all the way around the world. And they not only proved that Asia could be reached by sailing west from Europe, they had also proven for the first time in history that the world is round. True or false? Ferdinand Magellan was born in Spain. True or false? When Magellan was a child, he was trained to be a knight. True or false? Columbus made his first trip across the Atlantic before Magellan was born. True or false? Only 1 ship out of Magellan's original fleet of 5 made it back to Spain. True or false? Magellan was the first European to find a sea route around the tip of South America.